What's good? It's Woog. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you love music like I do. The Amir Questlove Thompson directed Summer of Soul was recently released, and it's about the Harlem Cultural Festival, a very under-celebrated and really under-known festival that was organized at a time when there was such an immense transition not only among black people, but in America as a whole. This was the end of the 60s. The country had gone through the assassination of JFK, the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Robert F. Kennedy. And so there was a ton of political upheaval throughout the civil rights mid-60s, and coming at the tail end of the 60s was more of an empowered sentiment within the black community. This was around the time of the Black Panthers and other organizations that were also trying to foster and cultivate a principle-based kind of way of living going forward, because there was so much to grapple with in the country. I mean, these were very revolutionary times, and it sparked some of the greatest music in the country's history, really. And you know what? In terms of the naming of this documentary, I mean, it's brilliant. Summer of Soul. So what Questlove essentially did here was he took an existing Summer of Love, which refers to 2 years prior, 1967, which was like the height of the flower power era. And this was best represented by the Monterey Pop Festival. See, the Summer of Soul, this 1969 concert, took place in the same year as Woodstock. So Woodstock in New York took place in 1969, and that's kind of looked at almost mistakenly as like the epicenter and flagship event of the flower power era, when really it was 2 years prior. It was in California around the time of the Haight-Ashbury scene in Berkeley and so forth. This was the Monterey Pop Festival, middle of the Summer of Love, 1967. That was the concert that Jimi Hendrix famously lit his guitar on fire, and Janis Joplin made her breakthrough live performance that actually got her a record deal with Clive Davis, with her band Big Brother and the Holding Company. Her breakthrough performance was at that Monterey Pop Festival. Again, we're talking Summer of Love. And so calling 1969's 2 years after the Monterey Pop Festival, coining this festival, now that he's releasing this documentary, the Summer of Soul, gives us an identifiable cultural experience that was really just as relevant, even though it's not as celebrated as the Summer of Love. Even though, again, Monterey Pop Festival was 1967, and the more culturally relevant, just in terms of how many people are familiar with Woodstock, took place 2 years later, 1969, the same year as this Summer of Soul. So in terms of coining it, Summer of Soul, brilliant. I don't know if that was his intent, but if that's what he was doing there, I love it. This obviously took place in Harlem, and, you know, it was a series of concerts shot at the park. I think it was Morris Park. Yeah, Mount Morris Park in Harlem. Series of concerts that featured, you know, the likes of young Stevie Wonder, Sly and the Family Stone, the Staple Singers, Nina Simone, and it goes on. And we're going to get into some of the artists and a little bit about the performances, but this was a huge deal. It was shot professionally, and the footage wasn't unearthed for the next 50 years. So this is the first exposure of this mega concert with thousands and thousands of people at the park, black folks at the park. You know, even the artists who performed, they remark as they were interviewed for this documentary how blown away they were to see this sea of black folks out there just celebrating and just existing in all our glory. And then you had, you know, a young charismatic Jesse Jackson at the time. The organizer of this Harlem Cultural Festival was Tony Lawrence, kind of a, you know, they describe him as somebody who would give a series of half commitments in order to get things done. Today we call it finessing, a hustler, but he was a positive hustler. I mean, people who were discussing it were remarking on how positive of an attitude he kept. So he's the festival's organizer. Again, this footage never saw the light of day. And in fact, it wouldn't sell after the concert because, Woodstock, again, was sucking up all of the energy that year in terms of festivals that were relevant. Nobody cared about Harlem. Harlem was a black and Spanish town, and that's why it's so important and so iconic that this series of festivals took place in Harlem because of its cultural relevance. Well, the people who shot the concert, they couldn't get anybody to buy it. Nobody wanted to invest in anything black, essentially. They didn't look at it as being important. The people who shot it went as far as to call it the Black Woodstock, which, should have helped, but didn't. And one more thing about the Summer of Love, 1967, that's also the year that the Beatles album, their most revered album, most celebrated and critically acclaimed album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album, that's when it was released, 1967. So many albums, that the Jimi Hendrix Experience, Are You Experience, look it up. That's a historical year, which, that merits its own video. But 1969, the Harlem Cultural Festival, portrayed in this Summer of Soul documentary, again, is so important that it was captured because, it adds this phrase, Summer of Soul, to the musical lexicon that, going forward, writers, journalists, TV directors, producers, they can use that to reference 1969 going forward. So let's go ahead and put that in the history books and add it to the language when we're talking about different years and how they were pivotal in certain transitions that we as a country have gone through and we as a black people are going through and have gone through. So Stevie Wonder performs here, and this is pre-70 Stevie, right? This is before he went on that 5-album classic album run that featured Songs in the Key of Life, Intervisions. It basically started with Music of My Mind and then culminated in Songs of the Key of Life. He went on a 5-album classic run. This is even prior to that. So he had some successful singles. He had Uptight, Everything's Alright. He had For Once in My Life. But this is before Signed, Sealed, Delivered, Superstition, and so forth. So this is like 19-year-old Stevie Wonder. He doesn't have the braids yet. He doesn't even have the afro yet. He's got kind of like a growing afro, but it's still pretty tight. And you just see him jamming, and he actually just rips the drums to pieces. Just a music savant. It's everything that you would imagine a 19-year-old Stevie Wonder would be. You just see the way he's moving, the way he's just freaking those keys, and oh my God, he's so in his element. It almost makes you want to cry. It's just a beautiful thing to behold. So the footage that they have of 19-year-old Stevie just doing his thing on the keys, on the drums, singing, moving, it's just something amazing. Gladys Knight and the Pips, they performed. And this is, again, younger Gladys Knight and the Pips. This is a few years before Midnight Train to Georgia. I think Midnight Train to Georgia came out in 73. This, again, was 69. So, their biggest hit was Heard It Through the Grapevine. And that was the version that was successful before Marvin Gaye would create an even more successful version of Heard It Through the Grapevine. The Staple Singers performed, and this is before I'll Take You There. This is actually just 1 to 2 years prior to their big song, or one of their biggest songs, I'll Take You There. So at this time, they were still transitioning out from becoming a gospel blues-ish band, because this is when it was the Staple Singers, but at the helm was Pops Staples, who was a bluesman himself. And so he basically put his family on, and then they would eventually carry the legacy even when he was out of the band. Mavis Staples, to this day, is killing it. You could catch her anywhere from a Coachella stage to, a big tour. She's still killing it. So this was pretty early in their development. Sly and the Family Stone was there. Wonderful performance. And this, again, I forgot who said it, but they said something like 1969 was the end of the Negro and the beginning of the black man. It was just a shift of consciousness. And, you see a band like Sly and the Family Stone come out, and they were an integrated band. For instance, they had a white dude on the drums, Greg Errico. So you've got this super psychedelic but funky, with the afros out, a super charismatic frontman, an all-timer in Sly Stone. You've got tremendous female backup singers who one of them, or at least one of them, was playing trumpet. Super versatile and gifted band, and they were just kind of the onset of funk music. Yes, James Brown had some hits before that, but Sly and the Family Stone, along with James Brown and others, are credited with kind of being on the pioneering side of funk, from which, Parliament and Funkadelic, both helmed by George Clinton and his, motley crew of ultra talented musicians and vocalists, they would spring from the roots that Sly and the Family Stone started. Sly and the Family Stone was coming out of San Francisco. Sly Stone was like a renowned session musician. He was just a mover and shaker out in that whole Bay Area, Haight-Ashbury scene. So this performance was just before their probably celebrated as their greatest album. It might not be their best album in terms of the one that you would just want to listen to day in and day out. I think that one is probably Stand. That one has Everyday People. But There Is a Riot Going On is probably their most celebrated album, and that came out in 1971, so that was after and probably in large part inspired by things like this Harlem Cultural Festival. But at the time of this concert, they had released a whole new thing, Dance to the Music. I'm naming the albums Life, which was 1968, and then 1969 was the album Stand, the one that I said was probably their best album, but not their greatest. That would, again, be There's a Riot Going On a couple years later. Well, Stand was actually released just 2 months prior to this festival taking place. It was released, I believe, in May of 1969. So, again, a phenomenal performance by Sly and the Family Stone. Nina Simone, I mean, she just performed. She was so representative of this movement, of this empowering movement, from her voice, which you can, hear the pain and the defiance, as one of the commenters on the concert was referring to when discussing Nina Simone. Beautiful performance. She performed Young, Gifted, and Black. She read a poem, I believe, by David Nelson at the end of it, which was by today's standards, it would sound very scary to a lot of people, and even, dare I say, threatening. Nina Simone wasn't playing. The Poets weren't playing. Black folks, we had our eyes on the prize. This was happening also at a time when there were growing problems in the ghetto. The poverty was unreal, lack of jobs, just all kinds of things impacting the community. But in terms of drugs, for instance, this was during the heroin era, but this was before the crack epidemic. So there was still a lot of cultural pride and the willingness to fight through these issues, fight for a better tomorrow. There was more optimism even in the wake of those assassinations and all the jailings and everything that was happening to Black folks throughout the 60s. There was optimism and real hope at the end of the 60s, but the crack epidemic, which would come in the late 70s and into the 80s and so forth, would totally upend basically almost every ghetto from coast to coast. It was just disastrous and tragic. So this is taking place before that, which has evidently set us back decades. So this was, again, a super crucial moment and just a very pivotal moment. And I think that it's very important that everybody takes a look at this documentary just to see what is really lost on our people in terms of, what we were doing when, just like you should look up, the Tulsa successes that we had before the massacre, Black Wall Street, and all of these different, another documentary by Ken Burns called Jazz is another absolute must watch for anybody, let alone for Black folks. We as a nation are still super young to where we have to do a lot of our homework to basically catch up on what we don't know about American history. And props to Questlove for rolling this documentary out to give us an opportunity to look at ourselves in the retrospect. Another thing about this documentary, they had Mayor John Lindsay, who was a super popular Republican mayor of New York City, but he was pretty popular amongst Black folks too. Super charismatic mayor. John Lindsay made an appearance, and Tony Lawrence called him up to the stage, introduced him, and the documentary covers the logistics involved and how pinpoint everything had to be to get this whole thing to, face the sunlight at the right time so you get natural light here. Basically, the logistics that go into creating a festival and actually pulling the thing off. Tony Lawrence obviously made a near impossible thing happen. And the documentary highlights some of the other key players as well. One of the greatest gospel singers of all time, Mahalia Jackson, she performs. And, there's a moment where her and I believe Mavis Staples are on the stage together. And Miss Staples refers to that as her crowning achievement, her greatest moments, to share the stage and a microphone with the great Mahalia Jackson. One other note about Sly and the Family Stone, this was a kind of a presentation that was not that common with black music yet. We were still in the deep midst of the Motown era, so we were exiting the stage where the Temptations had those hits, right? The Temptations' early hits before Papa Was a Rolling Stone and the things to come. We're talking the old hits that some people would call Shooby Doo-Wop style music. We were kind of coming out of that and transitioning into more songwriting. It wasn't just, Dozier, Holland Dozier, and Smokey Robinson and Barrett Strong writing the black hits at the time. Black artists were becoming auteurs, and whites had just gotten past that point too when they started creating greater albums as opposed to just a collection of singles. The mid 60s to late 60s is where the Beach Boys dropped Pet Sounds, the Beatles dropped Revolver and Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. And with albums like Stand and There's a Riot Going On, you can see that black artists were making greater albums and taking a more artistic stance. Marvin Gaye in 70 or 71, What's Going On? Another thing that kind of blew the audience's mind, and the artists were mind blown by the audience and the presence of the audience as well, was the Fifth Dimension, led by Billy Davis and Marilyn, Mccoo, and others. Just a beautiful band from the mid to late 60s that black folks thought was a white band because of their style of music. They're the ones who sang Aquarius and Let the Sunshine In. So they kind of had a flower power aura about them. I mean, as Billy Davis said, they came into music on the pop charts with Up, Up and Away and Aquarius. These were Grammy award winning songs, I think either Record of the Year or Song of the Year. And these were huge accomplishments for black artists, but they said, they being the Fifth Dimension and the artists, Billy Davis, Marilyn, Mccoo, were saying that this was something that was so important to them to perform at this Harlem Cultural Festival because, again, when they came into music, they were not really received by the black audience because they were marketed to a white audience playing on the white music stations. This was a very segregated time musically. There were white station and black station. Very little crossover or overlap between the two. So this was the Fifth Dimension's opportunity to play for a black audience, and this was also the black audience's chance to get familiar with the Fifth Dimension. And Marilyn Mccoo tearfully, said that they wanted to do this so bad. And even though they had super success in the pop realm, that this was the most important thing in the world to them, to be showcased to their people and hopefully be accepted or received by black people. And she said so tearfully. One of the better moments and more emotional moments of this documentary. But yeah, I could go on, but you need to see this Summer of Soul documentary. The late great trumpetist Hugh Masekela also performed. And this was after Grazing in the Grass, one of the greatest instrumentals of all time. Seriously, Grazing in the Grass by Hugh Masekela. He performed at that festival. Sonny Chirac, Max Roach, and Abby Lincoln. And on one of the festival days was literally on the day that man landed on the moon. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin. So while America is fixated on the moon landing, which obviously was a big, tremendous deal, and I think that this documentary showcases how much it impacted the sentiment of the country as well, did a great job of that. But to black folks, we weren't looking at the moon landing. I think Red Fox even said, you asked me what I think about, you asked me how I see the moon landing? And then he just looks up. Basically, it was not important to black people because we had so many more pressing issues going on in the community. So, they're interviewing people at the festival, asking what they think about the moon landing. And the festival goers are saying, hey, it don't mean a thing to me. Like, I get why people are excited about it and moved by it, but what does it mean to us? To us, it looks like wasted money. And so it was just a very interesting dynamic and conversation starter that this documentary presents, and I view this as a must-see. This is required viewing for music lovers, any type of historian, any type of person who wants reason to be optimistic perhaps for a better tomorrow in this country. I think that this represents kind of one of those building blocks educationally, and we could all benefit from it. But yeah, if you have seen the documentary, please let me know what you thought of it in the comments. If you haven't, please take a minute. It's on Hulu, or take an hour and a half, just over, and give that a watch. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you love music like I do. Props to Questlove, man. I'm glad that he produced or directed. It was produced by David Dinerstein, Robert Fivolent, and Joseph Patel. Cinematography by Sean Peters. But yeah, I am super glad that this was made, and I hope that it continues to get elevated in that Hulu queue, and that it doesn't just fall to the back pages, essentially. Because unfortunately, the festival itself did. And so let's try to resurrect this thing and claim its relevance, so that, you know, the Summer of Soul should be sitting side by side with the Summer of Love. They're 2 years removed from one another, but equally relevant, and everybody just needs to know about it. But yeah, like the video, subscribe to the channel if you love music like I do. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.